Hi, it's Justin with Spalted Stack Studio, and in this video we're going to make some quick and easy coasters. So I'm going to start by resawing some 6/4 mahogany. Now I like to use 6/4 material for this. It's the best way to make half-inch coasters with the least amount of waste. Now I could use 4/4 material. I would end up taking off a little less than a 1/4 inch material on the bandsaw. Well, I generally don't use that thin of material, so it would just sit around and take up space in the shop. So 6/4 is the best way to go for me. Okay, now I'm planing everything down to a 1/2 inch. Now, if you have straight blades for your planer, I highly recommend really paying attention to your grain. With the helical heads, you don't have to do it as much. Some really figured woods do still have a problem with tear out, but for the most part, I can send it any which way and it comes out smooth. So for this build, I'll be using two different types of mahogany. For the coasters themselves, it will be African mahogany, and for the base, it'll be genuine mahogany. And the base is getting planed down to 3/4 of an inch. The coaster's final width is going to be 4 1/4. But I'm going to set my fence for the ripping to 4 3/8. I'll rip this oversized because I want these coasters to be perfectly square. And in order for them to be perfectly square, you should use the same reference point. If you don't, and you use your table saw fence and then your tape measure, you might be slightly off, which you probably wouldn't pick up with your eyes, and in most cases this would be perfectly fine. But since these will be stacked up on top of each other, any slight variance is going to be very noticeable with your fingers. So what I'll do is I'll measure out 4 1/4 now, make my cross cut, and then flip it over 90 degrees and square it up. I'll go ahead and repeat this step for all 5 coasters. And as long as your sled is square, you're going to end up with perfectly square coasters. I use a similar process to create the base, and that's going to be 5 by 5. So now I'm marking 3/4 inches in, and that'll be for the posts that will hold the coasters in place. Okay, next I'll cut down a dowel rod to about 4 1/4 inches. Make sure you use something to hold this in place when you cut. Don't use your hands, it's just not worth the risk. Once I get those 4 cut, it'll be off the lathe. I'm not really doing much here, I'm just putting a slight chamfer onto it and taking a little bit of material off the area that'll be glued. I'm putting a slight chamfer on the base, nothing too heavy, just enough to break the corner. You don't want a very deep chamfer because if it gets too close to the post, it's going to look very off-putting. When you're gluing up, be sure that you're checking and making sure that everything is perfectly square. If it's off a little bit, it may bind the coasters and make them hard to push in. If it's off a lot, it's going to bind them completely and is not going to be usable. Now I did make a slight error here. When I did the test fit, I noticed that it was pretty snug, which would mean when I put the finish onto it, it's not going to fit at all. So I just took the coasters back to the table saw and knocked a 1/16 inch off both sides. Okay, next up we'll move to the laser, and I'm going to show you an easy way to make sure that your coasters are lined up perfectly. Square ones are easy, you can just use a grid, but round ones tend to pose a problem. So what you're going to do is tape a scrap piece of cardboard to your laser bed. Turn off your imaging and draw perimeters of your coasters. Once you do that, go ahead and cut it out and you'll have a nice little area to snap in your coasters. And this will make sure that everything's lined up perfectly. I don't like recording the laser working. I'm not really sure if it can damage the lens or the camera, and this was an hour and a half burn time, so it just wasn't worth the risk. After the burning process, it's time to sand. So I'm just using some double-sided tape and taping the coasters down to my workbench. Now, these need to be taped down to something that's flat. So if you don't have a nice flat workbench, make sure you're using your table saw or joiner or anything else that is perfectly flat. Now once you start sanding, just be really careful that you don't take too much material off. If you do, you're going to really mess up your laser burns. With the helical heads, I really don't have to do pre-sanding before the laser. Everything's pretty smooth. But if you have straight knives, you may want to sand it with some 120 before you burn. And that'll just ensure that you don't have to take off too much material to get everything nice and smooth. Okay, back to the router table. Again, I'm just doing a very slight chamfer. You're just doing enough to break the corners, and you definitely don't want to take too much off because you may get into your imaging. Off camera, I started the lacquering process. That's another situation where I'm concerned about my camera's well-being. I have a fairly small spraying area, and lacquer can be pretty damaging to some things, so I'm just really not willing to risk my camera's safety to record this yet. In the future, I will figure out a way to do this, but right now I just haven't gotten to it. I start with a very thin down lacquer. Normally it's about 60%, but that's going to vary based on your brand. I get mine from a local wood shop, and it has more solids per volume. So if you're getting it from the store, you might not have to thin it out as much as I do. And I like using a thin lacquer because it's like sealing the wood. It helps absorb into the grains and gives you a nice even look to your wood. And once you get that finish applied, you're going to want to sand it with some 400 grit sandpaper. And you're just doing it enough to help break the raised grains and any little defects that you've had. Once you get it sanded, you're going to wipe it off with a towel. Don't wipe it off too hard. Don't worry about getting all the dust off. You kind of want to work it into any pores or defects because the lacquer itself is a solvent-based finish. So when you spray on the next coat, it's just going to melt that dust. And as long as you don't have any grit from your sandpaper, you're not going to see it. Once I get everything sanded, I'll take it back down to my spraying area, and I'll spray it with a thicker batch of lacquer. And for that batch, I normally dilute it by like 10 to 15%, but you may not have to dilute it at all. And it also depends on your HVLP. Mine just can't handle the thickness of this lacquer, so I do have to thin it down no matter what. Okay, there you have it, some coasters in under 10 minutes. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe.